Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to the Watch Club. We're the monthly filmmaker interview series of the Newburyport Documentary Film Festival. I am Program Director James Sullivan, and I am very excited to welcome you to the beginning of what is our 20th anniversary, which is pretty amazing. So thanks for being with us. We are excited to talk to the filmmaker behind a new documentary that just premiered recently on PBS's American Experience called Nazi Town, USA. Peter Yost will be with us in just a moment. And as usual, what we're going to do is just take a quick look at the trailer to refresh the memories of those of you who've watched the film or give those of you who are watching us now but haven't actually gotten a chance to watch it yet a taste of what the film's about. So let's roll the trailer for Nazi Town, USA.
In ever-increasing numbers, the nation's youth has been going away to camp.
In the 1930s, there were these camps all across the country, and they looked normal. But it wasn't normal. It was Nazi camp.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
In the depths of the Depression, a great many Americans started to ask themselves whether the American experiment was failing.
Lots of Americans thought that capitalism, democracy, they were done for, and something else was going to have to take its place.
The membership card and the Friends of the New Germany. Note the American emblem, and over it the Nazi swastika.
As foreign as this might seem, fascist ideology tapped into some dark realities in America.
I'd like to tell you a few words about our purpose and aims.
He imagined that he was going to build a distinctively American version of Nazism.
They're after power. They're after influence within the very fabric of the United States.
They were literally holding parades in front of Jewish people's homes. There's no such thing as foreign fascism. Fascism is always homegrown.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Director Peter Yost. Hi, Peter.
Hey, James. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm good. Thanks for being here. One thing that I just noticed in rewatching the trailer just now is that, there's a little thing that says a little known story, right? And so let's start there. It wasn't a little known story at the time, right? Why has this episode in American history not been, is it selective memory on all of our part that you're sort of getting the opportunity to retell this sort of, forgotten story, this slice of American history?
I think that's an interesting question. Why was this largely shunted to the side, largely overlooked and forgotten? And I think the answer has much to do with the story that we all told ourselves and have been told coming out of World War II. And that conventional teaching was and is that America fought against fascism, which of course we did in World War II, and fought the good fight, quote unquote, and made the world safe for democracy. And in many ways that is true. I don't want to be too clever by half. We did fight against fascism. We did push back. We did in many ways, depending on your perspective, make the world safe for democracy and push back against this fascist threat. At the same time, I think it's important to not whitewash the complexity of what was really going on and what was going on in America in the years leading up to that fight against fascism in Europe. And what we explore in the film is this period in the 1920s and 30s when America really offered fertile ground for a number of the ideas that resonated with the far right groups and even the fascist groups and even the Nazi groups, that this wasn't quite as foreign an ideological set of beliefs as one might like to believe. And it was a very convenient and even comforting and clean narrative to tell ourselves after World War II that we had triumphed, that we had, again, as I just said, pushed back against these noxious notions, and to overlook the kind of uglier complexity of what had been going on in the years leading up to that period.
Right.
And so I think that's why this was largely overlooked.
Yeah. I'm going to take a moment to say to those who are watching live, if you would like to join the conversation or pose a question for Peter, please just type it into the chat, and we will do our best to make sure that we get a chance to pose the question to Peter before the end of our time here. So one thing that the film, among many things that the film does really well, I think, is lays out why these choices were being considered in the 1930s, obviously during the years of the Great Depression. And you point out, one thing that has come down, I think, a little bit better in the sense of history is the infatuation among some sort of on the hard left with communism, and which obviously ended with the McCarthy hearings and et cetera, but some of which you get into in the film. But the opposition between communism and fascism, which occurred in Europe and was also occurring here during the 1930s in the period that you document, very informative. One of the women who speaks on camera said, and I want to get this quote right, "We assume that democracy is something all Americans embrace. But at times of crisis, it's not always true, right?" And that's what happened in this period. And so there were Americans who were saying, maybe this isn't working. Some were thinking maybe communism is a better idea, and others were thinking maybe fascism is a better idea. Do you want to, what did you learn in the process of researching for that portion of the film?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's probably more widely known, or certainly it was to me growing up and even as an adult, to know about the McCarthy hearings and the real or imagined, overblown or not, domestic threat that we all believed that we faced as in America from the communist side. What was interesting, to answer your question, one of the interesting things that we came across researching this is actually the House Un-American Activities Committee, which we touch upon briefly in the film, and Hoover, who was involved in the creation of that, which we all know from the Red Scare and the 50s McCarthyism and that sort of stuff. And we very much, I think, generally associate with a push against the left, against the communists. But that HUAC, as it was known, House Un-American Activities Committee, was actually formed in the 1930s in large part to investigate threats from the right, not just from the left. And so that shows that the government, to some degree, was, it's hard to say equally, more or less, and the reasons for why they looked into some things more than others, but they were certainly concerned in many instances about the threat from the right, not just from the left. And so this was a real issue and something that was quite significant.
Yeah, and I mentioned the McCarthy era, which is early 1950s, and that's when most people place HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, I think, right? But yeah, right. The committee itself had been in existence for 15 or more years, right?
Yeah, and again, just to go after guys on the right. And then, and a lesson that's interesting about that too, depending on one's politics or whatever, is that when a government instrument or committee or whatever is created, even if one thinks it is being used in a particular moment for a particular purpose, it doesn't necessarily go away, and it can be used to prosecute or investigate the opposite position as well, which is arguably what happened. It was created for fear on the right, and then was ultimately, used in a kind of bludgeoning way against the left.
Right. Let's take a moment. I'm going to kind of veer a little bit. Can you just tell us a little more about yourself, Peter, your career? I mean, you're a professional documentary filmmaker. You've done lots of them, and you were telling me before we got started here that you've done a number of them for various series on PBS, right? So you want to just tell me a little bit about some of the highlights of your career?
Sure. I've done dozens of different projects over the years, a number of them for PBS, often through WGBH or GBH in Boston.
Right.
So I've done a number of different novas on everything from the anniversary of the Hubble Space Telescope to we made a Viking sword that was a mysterious Viking sword years ago, or So we've done a wide, or to inside the military's then secret drone program a number of years ago. So I've done a number for Nova. I've done a series called Mysteries of Mental Illness, looking at the history of psychiatry and intercutting contemporary people's struggles with different mental health issues, along with the history of how we've defined and treated those things. Done more than a dozen films over the years for National Geographic specials back in a different incarnation, but all over the world. And then some independent projects on everything from Tibetan refugee kids to cockfighting in Louisiana to a current feature-length project that's coming out soon. There was actually just got the Library of Congress Award from Ken Burns and the Levine Foundation. That's a feature-length documentary, all archival, but going inside the fiscal crisis in New York City in 1975, when essentially the city went essentially bankrupt. The infamous Ford to City drop dead.
Headline, right? Yeah.
So there's no through line whatsoever to my work, to my career, and except that I like to do a lot of different kinds of stuff if I can.
Yeah. So I'm a journalist, and I always say, this is, I mean, I get to write about something new every day or every week. And, sounds like you've had a very sort of parallel career, constant learning, constant, feeding your curiosity and just finding out about, weird or unusual or important or all of those things, topics. It's really cool. So, and I want to ask you one quick thing that I read in your bio, which is on your website. And then I think we have a question from an audience member, but really quickly, you spent some time studying at the Goethe Institute, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Is that correct? And in what way did that feed into, being around in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall? Did that in any way help you shape this film on the Nazi movement in America?
That's a really interesting question, which I am too obtuse to have thought of ahead of time. So thank you for asking it. It's I think, I mean, I've always had an interest in things German. I think being there, I was studying comparative European politics as an undergraduate, which sounds pretentious and ridiculous. And then none of my professors predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, none of them. And I was supposed to go to the library the next day and continue reading the books written by these folks who had failed to predict the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it seemed sort of like a fool's errand. So I actually pretty much, I had some extra credits saved up and made a deal with my parents where I could save them money on tuition if they'd give me a fraction of it, and I could go to Berlin where it was very, very cheap, still graduate on time and rent a shared room with a bunch of people and kind of be there for this, and which I did. And it was there that I actually, long story, but met Wim Wenders, the filmmaker, just by chance. And that just sparked something in me. He's incredible, needless to say. But being there, I think feeling and able to see on a daily basis, I was there for 6 or 7 months. And every day you could feel history, the wheels of history turning. I mean, I'm sure everybody watching has had certain moments, whether it was, the Kennedy assassination, 9/11, other things that have had first day of COVID, whatever, positive, negative, but just things where you're like, this is historic. And how is this going to play out? And there, I had been very interested in the history, and then seeing it manifesting. I was there when they were debating, should we move the capital back to Berlin, et cetera, et cetera. And I was wondering, is that such a good idea? Or maybe not so, I mean, given the history, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So history felt very alive for me. And I think that made me, I've always just kind of kept an eye on things German, been interested in that. And I was curious, because this is something a good friend of mine from college had made a short film, Marshall Curry, about the rally of the German American Bund in Madison Square Garden in 1939, which we of course feature in this film. And that was a very short film that Marshall had made that got an Academy Award nomination years ago. It was all of 7 or 8 minutes, and I had helped him a bit on that and had seen that footage. And as he was making it, I'm like, this is incredible footage. But what the heck is going on outside of this building? If you can get 20,000 of these guys inside Madison Square Garden, essentially Nazis at that moment in America, what is
Right.
going on in the country more broadly. And that, to some degree, was the launching point here. So a windy answer to your question, but I think I'd always been interested in Germany and obviously in some of these issues.
So there, you answered it. You did. You were saying maybe I hadn't thought it. You hadn't thought it through, or been.
Yeah.
But that was great. So we have a question from a viewer named Sharon, and I'm going to paraphrase Sharon. So she's saying your film makes concrete connections about idolizing idols, loving a politician for the enemies he has made. I think we all know what Sharon is alluding to. What are some hopes you have now that the film is out? About its impact, I assume she means, and the lessons that can maybe be learned, well, that can certainly be learned from watching your film.
Well, thanks for the question. It's hard to say what I hope for it. I mean, I think there's value, and I'm not claiming to be a neutral arbiter. It's impossible to say one is above. All of my biases and opinions are in this. That said, I've done what I can to be as straight as possible about excavating this history, not cherry picking things, but rather doing my best anyway within those constraints to kind of represent what were the politics of this group and how did it seem to fit into the politics more broadly in America at that time. And I hope, I guess, as people watch it, I think there's a value in and of itself to my mind. Not to sound like a bad 8th grade teacher, but I genuinely believe in kind of learning history, trying to learn from it and not be necessarily spun one way or the other. Again, I'm not claiming to corner the market on being objective, but to the extent possible to excavate records and to see what happened. And then to see if things do resonate, because I think there are lessons, at the risk of spouting cliche, but there are lessons to be learned. And even some cautionary tales, perhaps, as you mentioned, that people can easily fall for idols, as we see in this film, and even across time in all countries, and certainly now in certain ways. But I hope also that there might be some comfort to be had, and maybe that's me being too Pollyannish, but I found it oddly comforting to some degree, because I think there can be a tendency to think that we are at this horrific, unprecedented moment, and then every moment is different. And we might be, God forbid. But I also think that there are currents that aren't coming from nowhere. And America has been at very difficult spots before. We've been at crossroads before. There have been times where we've really fundamentally, in significant numbers, questioned democracy itself and its sustainability, its viability, and considered alternative options, and come out the other side. And again, it was a different time and there are different things, but there may be some echoes with today, and there might be some comfort and some cautionary lessons as well.
I'm fascinated by the way that you essentially refused to make those connections explicit in the film. Like, it's just a history lesson, and it's like, let the audience decide once they've watched your documentary whether or not they think they see connections to the present day. You're not trying to, like you kind of just said it, you're not trying to feed anybody any ideas. You're just saying this happened, 90 years ago, and take from it what you want. Right. So
I can genuinely say, we all know on a TikTok or on anything, one can edit things to quote unquote say whatever you want. On this, we had it's not like we cherry picked a few anti-Semitic things that these guys were putting forth, or a few, this or that. We represent the position as they would hold to back then, and the reams of data. So this is what people believed and what they did.
Right.
Now, if that resonates today, so be it. But that's what the history was.
Right. I knew about the, Madison Square Garden episode, but I didn't know about the, what's the word I'm looking for? Like the commotion that a Jewish protester, kind of rushed the stage. Right. And that was pretty intense. Got, beaten down basically in front of the crowd, right? And the Fritz Kuhn, the guy who led the Bund, is kind of just laughing it off, right? While the cops are breaking up his guard, Kuhn's guards, beating this guy, right?
This was
Go ahead.
Isidore Greenbaum, a guy named Isidore Greenbaum, Jewish guy from Brooklyn, who would come to check it out, basically out of curiosity, and lost his cool and charged the stage, and, as you say, was beaten down, and ultimately dragged away by the police, protected from further harm, but ironically brought up on civil disobedience charges for disrupting the rally. He had to pay a fine, which a number of cops kicked in. But yeah, and it showed the violence. And we did in the film go to pains to show, I mean, Greenbaum was arguably a heroic character, as was a journalist named Dorothy Thompson, who had gone to the same rally with the express purpose of, or goal of, heckling, which she did. And she was thrown out not once, but twice. Bodily from the Madison Square Garden. And then we talk about other people as well, pretty heroic journalists who, you know, wouldn't let go of this story and investigated the Bund and really made a difference, leading to congressional hearings, and regular Americans as well who pushed back. So we kind of tell the story of the Bund and the right-wing threat, and then also the counter to it as well.
I love the journalist you just mentioned, Dorothy Thompson. Her version of heckling at the event was to say "bunk," which pretty much puts the context. It definitely gives you the context of the era, right? Like sounds like she's in a film noir. So that's
isn't that what Patriots fans yell? You know, bunk.
That's funny. What do I want to ask you next? So I'll go to this audience member who's asking something that I'm curious to see how you handle it. His question is, what would the risks be of a second Trump term?
That's interesting. Well, at the risk of taking the fifth, I mean, it's out of my wheelhouse. I could only speak as a fellow clueless American. I'm trying to think in terms, and I think I do want to be careful a little bit. I mean, I'll answer a little bit, but I do want to be careful to say that the film genuinely is a deep dive into a particular moment in time. I think there are echoes, and I'm not being disingenuous and saying, what are you talking about? You know, and if people see parallels, I welcome that. And I think that's really cool and powerful. And I think in many cases they do. But I think what I feel qualified to speak about most directly is, you know, the deep digging we did on the 20s and 30s and what the state was in America. And so what a second, I think, and what it taught me was kind of at once how vulnerable the institution, democracy seemed to be, and yet at the same time, how ultimately resilient it was as well. And so I don't know. I mean, that would be the tension looking to a potential second Trump term, I would imagine, is how well can this, the chipping away or the opposition to this, how could democracy withstand that? And honestly, I don't know. But I think this raises questions and might scare some people at the answer.
Yeah, you said something. I can't remember if you said earlier, used the word strongman or something like that. But you know, the idea of the fascist, sort of strong leadership. Folks, are become willing to follow a strong. So there's quite a bit of it in the film about sort of the restoration of Germany after their loss in World War I and their crisis. So, economic crisis in the 20s and all of that. And then they rebuilt in part because they gave the responsibility to the strong leader. And when societies or nations are in trouble or feeling imperiled and helpless, that's when the fascist dictator types get to step in and say, I'm the guy who can fix this, right?
I think, and I think in the film, I think there's almost like a two-layer analysis, if you will, not that we're writing a term paper, but kind of scaffolding to the background on the rise of the Bund. And the first part was kind of just that there were certain set of beliefs and patterns in America that made the country in certain quarters somewhat, dare I say, fascist friendly, or at least fertile ground for some of these ideas. And those included the Jim Crow laws, which segregation of black and white, through legal means. And those laws were actually admired deeply by Hitler and the Nazis. And in many cases, they borrowed from them and even rejected some as too extreme. We had eugenics, which was a racial way of looking genetically at quote unquote superior races that was very mainstream and kind of the cornerstone of a lot of our science at the time, and by extension policy. We had hugely restrictive and race-based immigration policies, including the 1924 Immigration Act that ruled out a lot of non-white, non-Northern European immigrants. So we had all of these kinds of things that were very much in the water at the time. And then on top of that, you had the Great Depression, which freaked a lot of people out for very good reason, made them, in certain industrial places in the Midwest, where you had a lot of working class, heavy industry folks, they were up to 75 or 80% unemployment, and the crash of the stock market, et cetera. So there was legitimate economic fear and dislocation on top of all of those other beliefs. And the combination of those two things, the fear and then the underlying leanings in certain quarters in those directions, left a number of people open to, as you call them, a strong man.
Yeah. So all of that is extraordinarily well documented in your film. So for anyone watching this interview who maybe hasn't had a chance to watch it or finish it yet, I strongly recommend. That's what we do here in the Watch Club, is strongly recommend documentaries that are worth your time, and this certainly is one of them. So Peter, thanks so much for joining us, and I really appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward to your New York film. So maybe we'll have you back on sometime soon when you roll that one out. And in the meantime, I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors and say thanks for being with us, folks. Thanks for the good questions, and we'll see you next month in the Watch Club.